And finally, the Holy Spirit continues the work of Christ. That work Christ began is continued by the Holy Spirit's presence. He would not leave them hanging. He was not letting them out to dry. Thus he says in verse 16, or thus he says in verse 18, I will not leave you as orphans. I will come to you. In literature, orphans always carry around either a photograph or a memento of their dead parents. In the Harry Potter series, Harry Potter is an orphan. And he always has with him this magical photograph of his dead parents. Little Orphan Annie. In the Little Orphan Annie literature, Little Orphan Annie always has a locket that was given to her by her dead parents. A memento, a remembrance of someone who is dead and gone. Have you noticed? We come into this room to worship Him, and there's not a picture of Him. Have you noticed? There's not even something that represents Him. But I want you to understand that that is as it should be. We're not orphans. We don't carry around a memento of a loved one dead and gone. We don't come in here to remember He who has died. We come in here to experience the presence of He who is alive and His Spirit that is here. We're not orphans. Thus, this church stands square in the middle of a stream of Christian tradition that goes back centuries, known in Baptism as the Charleston tradition. And in the Charleston tradition, churches do not have images of Christ. Churches do not have icons representing Christ. And if a church has a cross in its sanctuary in the Charleston tradition, it is not a crucifix with the dying Christ hanging on it. It is an empty cross symbolizing a victorious, resurrected Christ who overcame the throne. We're not orphans. He sent His Spirit. Jesus' promise is that we will see Him. And we see Him when the Holy Spirit illumines our eyes and we open His holy word. The Holy Spirit reveals Christ to us in His word. The Holy Spirit is the continuing revelation of Christ. Listen to the promise that He made to them. But the Helper, the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name, He will teach you all things and bring to your remembrance all that I said to you. In that room was Peter. Peter would tell the stories of Jesus, and his traveling companion Mark would write them down. The Gospel of Mark. In that room was Matthew. Matthew experienced the personal relationship with the living Christ and the resurrected Christ, and he wrote down the things he remembered. Luke would be a traveling companion of Paul's and a close personal friend to many of the men that were in that room. And Luke would investigate things and he wrote them down as a gospel for us. And then John, the beloved disciple, was in that room. Mark's gospel was probably written during the decade of the 50s. Matthew's gospel was probably written in the decade of the 60s. Luke's gospel was probably written in the decade of the 70s. John's gospel was probably written in the decade of the 90s of the first century. The 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 90s, a 40-year period of people remembering and writing it down. And the Holy Spirit is guiding every step of the process to give us His Word. The human eye, your pupil and lens, from its smallest size to its largest size, it increases 4 times. The amount of light that it lets in covers an area in the back of the retina. From its smallest area to the largest area, it increases 16 times. Or to say it differently, in the dark, when your eyes are as wide open as they can be to try to see as much as you can, to the bright sunlight where your eyes close as much as they possibly can, on your retina it goes down to 1/16 of an area, and your pupil decreases to 1/4 of its previous size. Why the change? So you can see. So you can see. The Holy Spirit gives us a record that was recorded about 10 years after Jesus' death, 20 years after His ascension, 30 years after His going up, 50 years after His departure. From the shortest gospel, the first one, Mark, to the deepest gospel, the last one, John, it's like the illumination opens and opens and opens and opens. The Holy Spirit is making it possible for you to see Jesus in His Word. The world says seeing is believing. Christians say believing is seeing. The question is, do you believe? And in believing, do you love the Christ the Holy Spirit reveals to you? And will you obey Him? When you love Him and obey Him, the Holy Spirit responds.